She was just a maid earning $14 an hour. Then she found the Mafia boss's son bleeding to death.
Please, hide me.
Walking away would have...
There was enough blood on the imported marble to cost Flora her job, or worse, her life. She didn't care about the mob war outside. She just wanted to finish her shift. But dragging a dying heir through the mud changed the rules. Tomorrow, the mop wouldn't save her. The estate's industrial washing machines hummed a vibration Flora could feel in her teeth. It was a comforting, rhythmic rattle, usually enough to drown out the noise from the main house. Tonight, it wasn't. Tonight, the thunder was cracking directly over the coastal ridge, rattling the narrow, frosted windows of the basement laundry room. Her name was Flora. She was paid $14 an hour to ensure the Falco family's sheets were blindingly white. Their crystal was streak-free, and she saw absolutely nothing. The estate had gone into lockdown an hour ago. The heavy steel shutters rolled down over the floor-to-ceiling windows upstairs with a hydraulic hiss. She knew what that meant. It meant she was stuck here, unpaid overtime, listening to a storm tear the coastal trees apart, while the family dealt with whatever ugly business had followed them home from the city. She sat on an overturned plastic detergent bucket, staring at her cracked phone screen. 0 bars. Typical. Then, the utility door at the far end of the service corridor slammed open. She didn't jump. Working for a syndicate dulls the startle reflex. She just sighed, sliding the phone into the pocket of her gray uniform apron, and stood up. Her knees popped. She grabbed a spray bottle of industrial bleach and a heavy microfiber rag. If someone tracked mud down here, she'd be the one scrubbing it out of the grout with a toothbrush. The corridor was dark, lit only by the flickering emergency bulbs triggered by the storm's power surges. The smell hit her before she saw anything. It wasn't mud. It was the sharp, metallic tang of copper, hot and heavy in the damp basement air, underscored by the unmistakable scent of sweat and voided bowels. Gunshot wounds are never dignified. They don't smell like victory. They smell like a butcher shop, left in the sun. She rounded the corner. Noa Falco was slumped against the cinder block wall. He was 22, the youngest son of the boss, and usually, he looked like a billboard for arrogant, untouchable wealth. Now, his bespoke charcoal suit jacket was torn, soaked through with something thick and black in the dim light. He was panting, short, wet gasps that sounded like a flooded engine trying to turn over. "Hey," he rasped. His head lolled toward her. His face was chalky, stripped of all its usual sneering color. She stopped 10 feet away. The bleach bottle was cold in her hand. Her brain ran a cold, mechanical calculation. If she touched him, she was part of this. If she helped him, she crossed the line from staff to participant. Participants get shot. Staff just get yelled at. She took a half step backward. The smart move was to lock herself in the laundry room, put headphones on, and let whoever shot him finish the job. Noah slid another 2 inches down the wall, leaving a wide, wet smear against the white paint. "Please," he said. It wasn't a romantic plea. It was a pathetic, bubbling sound. She looked at the blood on the floor. It was pooling fast, creeping toward the drain in the center of the concrete. She looked at the smear on the wall. "I'm going to have to clean that," she thought, wildly detached. "You're bleeding on the floor," she heard herself say. Her voice sounded flat, annoyed. He laughed, and the sound broke off into a wet cough. Specks of red dotted his chin. "Sorry." She closed her eyes. The thunder rattled the walls again. She hated her own weakness. It wasn't heroism that made her move forward. It was a pathetic, ingrained inability to just watch a kid bleed out like a stuck pig on linoleum. She walked over and crouched beside him. His skin was clammy, radiating a sickly heat. "Where is it?" she asked, snapping on a pair of blue nitrile cleaning gloves. "Stomach," he hissed. "And my thigh, I think." She pulled back the ruined fabric of his jacket. The smell worsened. The stomach wound was messy, a jagged tear just below his ribs. He was pressing a useless, soaked silk handkerchief against it. "Who's coming for you?" she asked, her voice tight. "Don't know." Men. From the gate. Betrayal. His eyes were rolling back, the whites showing. "Hey, she snapped, slapping his cheek hard enough to leave a red mark. He blinked, startled. If they're coming from the gate, they're going to sweep the basement. The service elevator is right there. Hide me, he breathed. I can't hide you here. It's a white room, Noah. You're leaking red. There was only one place, the old cellar beneath the abandoned greenhouse, on the edge of the property. It was off the grid, overgrown, and useless. The family hadn't stepped foot in it for a decade, but it was 300 yards away, outside, in the middle of a torrential squall. Get up, she told him. Can't. You're going to have to. She grabbed his left arm, draping it over her shoulder. He was dead weight, 180 pounds of dead, expensive muscle. She dug her cheap, rubber-soled shoes into the concrete and heaved. Pain shot up her lower back. She let out a sharp, ugly grunt. Noah cried out, his legs buckling, but she caught him against her hip, essentially wedging her body under his armpit. Walk, she gritted out, or I drop you right here and tell them where to find you. He didn't argue. He just groaned, a long, low sound of pure agony, and dragged his right foot forward. They staggered toward the exterior storm doors. The heavy metal handle was freezing. She shoved it open. The wind immediately ripped the door from her grip, slamming it against the brick exterior with a deafening crash. The storm didn't just rain on them, it assaulted them. The cold was instantaneous. The rain came down in sheets, heavy and stinging, driven sideways by a wind that roared like a jet engine. Within 3 seconds, her uniform was plastered to her skin. Within 5, her teeth were chattering so violently, her jaw ached. Keep moving, she yelled over the wind, though she doubted he heard her. They stumbled off the concrete path and onto the lawn. It was a mistake, but they had to avoid the floodlights illuminating the main drive. The manicured grass had already turned into a shallow swamp. Her foot sank up to the ankle in freezing muck. Her shoe nearly sucked right off. Noah was faltering. His chin dug into her collarbone, his breath hot and ragged against her wet neck. He smelled like iron and expensive sandalwood, a combination that made her stomach churn. Flora, he mumbled into her neck. She didn't even know he knew her name. Shut up and pick your feet up, she screamed back. They hit the tree line. The canopy offered a slight reprieve from the pounding rain, but the ground here was worse. Thick roots broke through the slick mud, creating a treacherous obstacle course. It was pitch black. She was navigating purely by memory, aiming for the dark silhouette of the ruined greenhouse glass against the slightly less dark sky. Suddenly, Noah's knee gave out entirely. His weight shifted violently, pulling her off balance. She twisted, trying to hold him, but the mud offered no friction. They went down hard. She hit the ground first, her shoulder driving into a thick, exposed root. The pain blinded her for a second, a bright, hot flash behind her eyes. Noah collapsed heavily on top of her, his elbow catching her in the ribs. She gasped, inhaling rain and mud. For a long, pathetic moment, she just lay there in the freezing dirt, pinned beneath a dying mobster, listening to the storm tear the branches apart above them. She wanted to stay there. It was so much easier to just stop. Her lungs burned. Her uniform was ruined. Her back was screaming. Leave him, a cynical voice in her head whispered. He's not your problem. He's one of them, the people who look at you like your furniture. Noah shifted. A weak, wet cough bubbled from his chest. Leave me, he rasped, echoing her own thoughts. Just go back. She shoved him, hard. He rolled off her with a grunt, landing on his back in the mud. She sat up, spitting grit out of her mouth, her hands sinking into the freezing slime. She looked down at him. His face was pale, his eyes closed. The rain was washing the blood from his suit, faster than he could bleed it, turning the puddle beneath him a diluted, rusty pink. She hated him. She hated his father. She hated this estate. But more than anything, she hated the idea of letting the storm win. I am not, she panted, wiping mud from her eyes with a filthy wrist. Hauling your heavy ass halfway across this yard just to let you die in a puddle. It makes my effort completely pointless. She scrambled to her knees, grabbed the lapels of his ruined $1000s suit, and hauled his upper body off the ground. "Get up." He opened his eyes. They were unfocused, glassy, but he reached out, his bloody fingers digging into the fabric of her wet apron. She got her shoulder under him again. They rose in increments, first to their knees, slipping and sliding, and then, with a gargantuan, muscle-tearing heave, to their feet. She was carrying most of his weight now. He was dragging his right leg entirely, his shoe leaving a long, deep gouge in the mud. They reached the rusted iron doors of the greenhouse cellar. The glass above them was mostly shattered, the wind howling through the jagged frames. She dropped him unceremoniously onto the wet concrete of the stairs. He hit the steps with a dull thud and didn't make a sound. Panic, sharp and cold, pierced through her exhaustion. She fumbled with the heavy iron ring of the cellar door. It was stiff with rust. She kicked it, once, twice. On the third kick, it gave way with a screech that made her teeth ache. She grabbed Noah by the collar and under one arm, dragging him backward down the stone steps like a sack of potatoes. His heels bumped over every edge. She didn't care about being gentle anymore. She just needed him inside. She pulled him over the threshold, kicked the heavy iron door shut, and slid the rusty deadbolt home. The silence was abrupt and deafening. The storm was muffled to a dull roar. It was pitch black in the cellar, smelling of mildew, dry rot, and old fertilizer. She collapsed onto the stone floor beside him, her chest heaving, sucking in the stale, dusty air. She was shivering so violently, she could hear her joints popping. "Noah," she croaked. She reached out in the dark, her hand brushing his cold, wet cheek. He didn't move. She felt for his neck. Her fingers were numb, clumsy, searching blindly in the dark. Finally, beneath the cold skin, she felt it, a pulse. Fast, weak, and reedy. But there. She didn't have medical supplies. She had a roll of duct tape she found in a rusted toolbox, a pile of old burlap sacks, and the relatively clean undershirt she ripped off Noah's back. She spent the first hour in the dark, pressing the wadded-up cotton of his undershirt into the hole in his stomach, using her own body weight to keep the pressure on. The blood was sticky, drying on her forearms in stiff, itchy patches. Every time the wind howled outside, Noah would flinch in his unconscious state, a sharp intake of breath that ended in a whimper. She talked to him, not to comfort him, but to keep herself awake. "If you bleed out on me, I'm going to roll you into the compost bin," she muttered into the darkness. Her teeth were still chattering. "I have a shift tomorrow. I have to scrub the baseboards in the west wing. If I fall asleep down here, Mrs. Gable is going to dock my pay." He didn't answer. He just kept breathing, a terrible, wet, rattling sound in the dark. Sometime around 4 a.m., the bleeding finally slowed enough that she could tape the makeshift bandage down. She wrapped the duct tape entirely around his torso, pulling it so tight he groaned in his sleep. It was crude, it was dirty, and he'd probably die of sepsis if the blood loss didn't kill him first. But it was all she had. She sat back against the cold stone wall, pulling her knees to her chest, and waited. The transition from night to morning wasn't dramatic. The storm just eventually ran out of breath. The howling wind died down to a tired whistle, and the heavy rain thinned into a steady, gray drizzle. Faint, watery light began to seep through the cracks in the cellar doors, illuminating the absolute squalor of their surroundings. She looked at her hands. They were stained a deep, rusty brown, the blood packed beneath her fingernails. Her uniform was a stiff, filthy mess of mud, blood, and ripped fabric. She looked at Noah. In the gray light, he looked like a corpse. His skin was the color of old wax, his lips a faint, bruised blue, but his chest was still rising and falling. Then, she heard it. The crunch of gravel outside, the heavy thud of boots. Voices, low and urgent, carrying through the damp morning air. She froze. Her hand instinctively went to the heavy iron wrench she had pulled from the toolbox earlier. It was a pathetic weapon against men with guns, but the animal part of her brain demanded she hold it. The voices grew louder. They were right outside the cellar doors. "Check the old greenhouse," someone barked. She knew that voice. It was Callan, the head of the Falco security detail. But were they looking for Noah to save him? or to finish the job. The heavy iron door rattled. The deadbolt groaned against the pressure. "It's locked from the inside," a second voice yelled. "Break it." She didn't have time to think. If they broke it down and found her hovering over the boss's son with a wrench, they'd shoot her before asking questions. She scrambled forward, her stiff muscles screaming in protest, and hit the deadbolt. She yanked the door open and immediately threw her hands in the air, the wrench clattering to the stone floor. 3 guns were pointed at her face. The men froze. They stared at her. She must have looked like a monster, a wild-eyed, mud-caked, blood-soaked creature rising from a tomb. "Put the guns down." The voice came from behind the guards. The men parted instantly, lowering their weapons. Vincent Falco stepped forward. The boss. He was a man who commanded the very air around him. He wore a heavy wool overcoat, perfectly dry, perfectly pressed, his silver hair immaculate despite the damp morning. His dark eyes bypassed her entirely, locking onto the pale figure lying on the stone floor behind her. For a fraction of a second, the iron mask on Vincent's face slipped, revealing something raw and terrified. Then, it snapped back into place. He walked past her without a word. He knelt beside his son in the dirt, heedless of his expensive trousers. He pressed 2 fingers to Noah's neck, checked the crude duct tape bandage, and then looked back up at her. "You did this?" Vincent asked. His voice was quiet, gravelly, and terrifyingly calm. She swallowed hard. Her throat felt like sandpaper. "Yes, sir. He's alive because of you." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. The guards were already swarming the cellar, carefully lifting Noah onto a stretcher they had conjured from nowhere. Paramedics, the underground kind that didn't ask questions, were suddenly pouring down the stairs. She stood backed against the damp wall, shivering in her ruined apron, watching the chaos. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to go back to the laundry room, spray some bleach, and pretend none of this happened. Vincent stood up. He walked over to her. He didn't invade her space, but his presence was suffocating. He reached into his coat and pulled out a pristine, white silk handkerchief. He held it out. She looked down at her hands, shaking, covered in his son's blood. She took the handkerchief. It felt too soft against her calloused, filthy skin. "What is your name?" Vincent asked. "Flora," she whispered. "Flora," he repeated. The way he said it felt like a brand being pressed into her skin. "You are no longer a maid in this house, Flora. You belong to the family now." He turned and walked up the stairs, following the stretcher. She stood alone in the cold, damp cellar, clutching the silk handkerchief. She looked at the dark, bloody outline Noah had left on the floor. Vincent Falco thought he had just rewarded her. He thought he had given her a gift, but she knew the truth. As she stood shivering in the morning light, listening to the sirens in the distance, she realized her life was over. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was seen, and in this world, being seen was a death sentence. The water in her new bathroom ran scalding hot. She stood under the rainfall showerhead until her skin was bright red and sensitive to the touch, watching the rust-colored water swirl down the chrome drain. It took 3 washes to get the smell of copper out of her hair. Even then, she thought she could still catch a phantom whiff of it every time she turned her head. They had put her in a guest suite on the 3rd floor, the east wing. It was a part of the house she had only ever seen when covering for a sick housekeeper. The carpet under her bare feet was impossibly thick, Chico swallowing the sound of her steps. The walls were covered in a pale, muted silk wallpaper that probably cost more per square foot than she made in a year. She hated it. She hated the silence most of all. Down in the basement, there was always a hum. The pipes, the washers, the muffled thud of footsteps from the kitchen above. It was the sound of a machine working. Up here, the silence was suffocating. It felt like holding your breath underwater. A knock at the door made her flinch. Her bruised ribs ached sharply with the sudden movement. She tightened the belt of the plush white robe they had left for her, a robe that was too long, too soft, and felt entirely unearned. "Come in," she said, her voice cracking. It was the first time she had spoken since the cellar. The heavy mahogany door clicked open. It wasn't Vincent Falco, and it wasn't one of the armed guards in tailored suits. It was Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, her boss. For 2 years, Mrs. Gable had barked orders at her. She had docked her pay for being 3 minutes late. She had made her scrub the grout in the foyer with a toothbrush because a guest had tracked in a single fleck of tar. Now, she stood in the doorway, holding a silver tray, refusing to meet her eyes. "Your dinner, Miss Flora," she said. Her voice was stiff, trembling slightly at the edges. "Miss Flora." Her stomach turned over. "You don't have to call me that," she said, stepping out of the bathroom. "And you don't have to bring me food. I can go down to the staff kitchen." Mr. Falco left strict instructions. Mrs. Gable walked into the room, her eyes fixed firmly on the coffee table. She set the tray down with a soft clink. Roasted chicken, asparagus, a glass of dark red wine, real crystal, not the chipped mugs they use downstairs. "You are not to return to the staff quarters. Your things have been disposed of. New clothing has been placed in the wardrobe." "Disposed of?" Flora stared at her. "My phone, my wallet, my mother's necklace was in my locker. Everything." Mrs. Gable finally looked up. Her eyes were hard, not with anger, but with a deep, primal fear. She looked at Flora the way one looks at a bomb with a ticking timer. "You are family now. The family does not keep locker trash." She turned and practically fled the room. Flora stood in the center of the massive room, shivering despite the heavy robe. She walked over to the wardrobe and pulled the double doors open. It was filled with clothes in her size. Cashmere sweaters, tailored trousers, silk blouses in neutral, expensive colors. The shoes lined up at the bottom were buttery leather, untouched. It wasn't a reward. It was a uniform, a different kind of apron. She didn't eat the chicken. She drank the wine in 2 long gulps, letting the alcohol burn the back of her throat, hoping it would put her to sleep. It didn't. She spent the night lying on top of the covers of the king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for someone to realize they had made a mistake and send her back downstairs. Morning came, gray and indifferent. She put on a pair of the dark trousers and a soft gray sweater. The fabric felt like a lie against her skin. A guard named Declan came for her at 10 o'clock. He didn't knock. He just opened the door, nodded his head toward the hallway, and waited. She followed him through the sprawling, quiet corridors, her new leather flats, making absolutely no sound. They stopped outside a set of double doors at the end of the west wing. A makeshift ICU. The heavy scent of iodine and rubbing alcohol bled through the crack under the door, instantly dragging her mind back to the smell of blood in the dirt. Her chest tightened. She couldn't breathe properly. Declan opened the door and stepped aside. The room was vast, dominated by a hospital bed surrounded by monitors that beeped in a slow, steady rhythm. The heavy drapes were pulled back, letting in the harsh, overcast daylight. Noa Falco looked worse in a clean bed than he had in the mud. Without the adrenaline, his body had collapsed into the trauma. He was hooked up to IV bags, clear fluids, and a thick, dark pouch of blood. His face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over his cheekbones. A tube ran under his nose, hissing softly with oxygen. He was awake, his head turned toward the window, staring blankly at the rolling gray clouds. "Sit," Vincent Falco's voice came from the corner of the room. She jumped. She hadn't seen him sitting in the shadows, in a leather armchair, a tablet resting on his knee. He didn't look up from the screen. He just pointed a finger at a hard wooden chair placed a few feet from Noah's bed. She walked over. Her legs felt like lead. She sat down on the very edge of the chair, keeping her hands folded tightly in her lap, so no one could see them shaking. Noah slowly turned his head on the pillow. His dark eyes locked onto hers. The glassy, dying glaze from the cellar was gone, replaced by a dull, throbbing pain. He looked at her hair, clean and dry. He looked at the expensive sweater she was wearing. "You look different." His voice was a ruined rasp. Every syllable sounded like it cost him a sliver of his soul. "So do you," she replied. She didn't mean to say it. The filter between her brain and her mouth had apparently washed away in the storm. Vincent Falco stopped tapping on his tablet. The silence in the room suddenly felt incredibly dangerous. But Noah just let out a short, breathy exhale that might have been a laugh if his chest wasn't stitched together. "Fair enough," Noah whispered. He closed his eyes. The monitor beeped. "Why did you do it?" She looked down at her hands. Her cuticles were still stained, a faint yellowish brown from the old blood. "I didn't want to scrub your mess off the corridor wall." Noah opened his eyes again. A tiny, painful smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Liar." "Noah," Vincent warned softly from the corner. It wasn't a reprimand. It was a reminder to conserve his strength. "She dragged me," Noah said, his eyes never leaving hers. 300 yards, through the mud. She kicked the door open. She taped me together. He shifted his gaze to his father. "If she wanted me dead, she could have walked away. You owe her. I have already paid her," Vincent said smoothly. He finally set the tablet down and stood up. The tailored suit hung perfectly on his frame. "She has a place here now. A permanent one." Flora felt the blood drain from her face. A permanent place. Vincent walked over to the bed, placing a heavy hand on Noah's uninjured shoulder. "Rest. The men who did this have been identified. It is being handled." He didn't look at her as he walked toward the door. "Flora will stay with you today. Callan is right outside if you need anything." The door clicked shut. They were alone. She stared at the blinking green line on the heart monitor. She couldn't look at Noah. The reality of what had happened was settling heavily onto her shoulders. She hadn't just saved a life. She had entered a blood pact she never consented to. She was a stray dog they had brought inside because it chased away a rat. But she was still a dog, and the doors were locked. "You hate this," Noah stated. It wasn't a question. "I want to go back to the laundry room," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I want my cheap uniform and my $14 an hour. I want to be invisible." "You can never be invisible again," he said quietly. He shifted, a grimace of sharp agony crossing his face. His hand twitched toward his side, where the stitches pulled tight. "The people who hit me, they know someone hid me. They know someone kept me alive long enough for my father's men to find me." Her breath hitched. "No." "Yes," Noah said softly. He reached out, his pale, bruised hand resting on the white sheet, palm up. "If my father lets you leave this estate, you'll be dead in 3 days. They'll pull you off the street and peel you apart to find out what you heard." She stared at his outstretched hand. The room felt like it was shrinking. The thick walls, the armed guards, the expensive clothes. It wasn't a reward. It was a witness protection program run by the very people she needed protection from. "So I'm a prisoner," she whispered. "You're a survivor," he corrected, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Just like me. We're both trapped by my father's name now. At least here, you breathe." He left his hand resting on the sheets. She didn't take it. She just sat there, listening to the machine pump oxygen into his lungs, realizing that the storm outside had never ended. It had just moved indoors. 3 weeks bled into one another, the rhythm of her life completely inverted. She no longer woke at 5 in the morning to the sound of an alarm clock. She woke whenever the silence of her massive bedroom became too loud to bear. She was not staff, but she was not family. She was a ghost haunting the upper floors. When she walked down the corridors, the maids, women she used to eat lunch with, women who knew her mother's maiden name, pressed their backs against the walls and averted their eyes until she passed. She stopped trying to talk to them. The fear in their eyes was a mirror she couldn't stand to look into. Instead, her days belonged to Noah. His recovery was slow, brutal, and ugly. The syndicate brought in a private physical therapist who looked more like a Russian hitman than a doctor. She was expected to be there for every session. Vincent Falco had decreed it. She saved him. She anchors him. It was a twisted psychology. Vincent believed that because she had dragged Noah through the mud, she was the only person Noah couldn't lie to about his weakness. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The coastal sun was finally cutting through the gray, casting long, sharp shadows across the estate's sprawling library. Noah was leaning heavily on a black cane, sweat beading on his forehead, his knuckles white with strain. The therapist had left 10 minutes ago, but Noah refused to sit down. He was pushing himself too hard. driven by a dark, volatile anger. The syndicate was moving on without him. Whispers of a counterstrike against the rival family were echoing in the halls, and Noah was stuck in a library, learning how to walk again. He took a step, his right leg dragging slightly. His knee buckled. He went down with a heavy, ungraceful crash, knocking over a side table. A crystal whiskey decanter shattered across the Persian rug, the amber liquid soaking into the ancient wool, filling the air with the sharp, peaty smell of alcohol. "God damn it," Noah roared, striking the floor with his good fist. He sounded like a wounded animal. The two guards by the double doors immediately stepped inward, their hands instinctively moving toward their jackets. "Get out," Noah snapped at them, not looking up from the floor. His chest was heaving. The guards hesitated, looking at Flora. She gave them a short, sharp nod. She didn't know where the authority came from, but they stepped back out and closed the heavy doors. She walked over to the mess. The smell of the whiskey mixed with the lingering scent of old books and leather furniture. She crouched down, carefully picking up the larger shards of broken crystal, her hands steady. "Leave it," Noah breathed out, his forehead resting against the rug. He looked broken. The untouchable Mafia prince shattered on the floor next to a broken bottle. "If I leave it, someone else has to clean it up," she said quietly, piling the glass onto the wooden tray of the fallen table. "And if they clean it up, they'll see you on the floor." He went entirely still. Slowly, he lifted his head. The anger in his eyes was raw, but it wasn't directed at her. It was directed at his own failing body. "I'm useless like this," he whispered, the admission costing him heavily. "My father looks at me and sees a liability. The men look at me and see a target." She stopped gathering the glass. She looked at him. The expensive clothes didn't hide the hollows of his cheeks. The arrogant sneer was gone, replaced by a cynical, desperate edge. "When we were in the mud," she said, keeping her voice perfectly level, "you told me to leave you. You gave up." His jaw tightened. "I was bleeding to death." "You were," she agreed, "and I was a maid with a bad back who had just worked a 12-hour shift. But I didn't leave you. I dragged your heavy, bleeding body across that lawn because quitting is a luxury only rich people can afford. I didn't have the luxury of giving up. Neither do you." He stared at her, his dark eyes searching her face. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. She stood up, wiping her hands on her expensive, tailored trousers. She didn't care about the fabric anymore. She held her hand out to him, not a gentle offering, but a solid, pragmatic brace. "Get up, Noah." He looked at her hand. Then, with a slow, agonizing groan, he grabbed her forearm. His grip was bruising, his fingers digging into her muscle. She braced her legs, ignoring the residual twinge in her own shoulder, and pulled. He managed to get his good leg under him, hauling himself up until he was standing, swaying slightly. They were inches apart. She could smell the sweat on his skin, beneath the expensive cologne. She could feel the rapid, unsteady beat of his pulse, where her thumb pressed against his wrist. He didn't let go of her arm. "You're not a maid anymore, Flora," he said. His voice was low, devoid of its usual polished cadence. It was raw. "Stop thinking like one." "Then what am I?" she challenged, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I'm not your friend. I'm a hostage. You're an accomplice," he corrected softly, his grip tightening just a fraction before he released her. "You saved a Falco. You belong to the blood now, whether you like it or not. The world outside those gates is dead to you. You need to figure out how to survive inside them." He turned, leaning heavily on his cane, and limped toward the window. The afternoon sun hit the side of his face, illuminating the sharp, rigid lines of his jaw. She stood by the broken glass, her arm still burning where he had gripped it. He was right. The Flora, who worried about bleached baseboards and $14 an hour, had died in the cellar that night. The woman standing in this library, wearing silk and cashmere, was someone else entirely. She walked over to the small wet bar in the corner of the room. She grabbed 2 heavy crystal tumblers and a fresh bottle of bourbon. She poured 2 fingers into each glass. The clink of the glass was sharp and clear in the quiet room. She walked over to the window and handed him one of the glasses. He looked at the drink, then at her. A faint, cynical smile touched his lips. He took the glass. "To survival," he muttered, raising the glass a fraction of an inch. "To whatever comes next," she replied. There was no fairy tale here, no sweeping romance to save her from the darkness. Noa Falco didn't love her, and she certainly didn't love him. They were bound by trauma, by necessity, and by the sheer, unyielding gravity of his father's world. He was a broken monster, learning how to bare his teeth again. And her? She took another slow sip of the bourbon, feeling the cold, hard edge of a new resolve settling into her bones. The fear was gone. In its place was something darker, something calculating. If she was going to be trapped in a cage with monsters, she was going to have to learn how to bite. She wasn't going to just survive the Falco family. She was going to make herself indispensable. By morning, her life was unrecognizable. But as she looked at her reflection in the window glass, standing shoulder to shoulder with the heir to a criminal empire, she finally realized something terrifying. She liked this reflection better. Did Flora make the right choice? Or did she just seal her own dark fate in a world she can never escape? When survival turns into ambition, the line between victim and villain disappears. If this gritty, raw dive into the underworld kept you hooked, hit that like button, share this video with your fellow dark romance fans, and make sure to subscribe for more intense, slow-burn stories. What would you have done? Let me know in the comments.